Hello everyone, this is Immune to Gravity with an extremely important update on this channel's future. Now, it took me a while to think of a way to say this without you clicking out of the video immediately, because there is good news. So I'll just try it like this. There is a new reading, and there will be new readings out much more frequently than in the past. They are not on this channel. They are not fanfiction or creepypasta of any kind, and I will never be doing fanfiction readings again, especially on this channel. Now, with that all in the air, let me go into a little bit more detail. I have started a new channel called Campfire Productions, and on it, I have created a new series called Tales by the Fire. I even managed to get an artist to draw me an original icon, instead of just using random images I find on the internet like some sort of plagiarist. The idea for this channel started when I noticed that on the internet, the whole dramatic reading thing with, My Little Pony readings and creepypasta readings really wasn't taking advantage of the medium's full potential. Back in the 60s and 50s, when radio was king, radio plays like Sherlock Holmes and things like that were everywhere, and they sort of were the substitute for television until it came along. But ever since recently, with pretty much this whole resurgence of the audio drama started by Mr. Creepypasta, it's really only been a very niche crowd and really hasn't gone out to other genres like fantasy or action or tragedy or romance. It's all just horror. And even when My Little Pony came along and readings of those fanfictions became popular, it was still kind of restrictive because even though you had more genres, you were restricted to writing about one single series. And to be honest, I just sort of felt like I was in a chokehold the whole time. For those of you who are only subscribed to me for my MLP readings specifically, then I suggest you just leave now. But for those of you who just love stories or audiobooks in general, and just want to see some new undiscovered stories being read with some sound effects and music, then I suggest you subscribe to the channel. The first video is already up on the channel, so you can check it out now to see if you like it. It's going to be on a weekly uploading schedule, being posted every Tuesday. Why Tuesday? Because I uploaded it on a Tuesday, and at the end of the video I said that I'd have a new one next week, so I guess now it's Tuesday. I highly recommend you guys check it out, if not for me, at least for the story. It's a really well-written story for one that hasn't ever been published. It was ranked really high on fictionpress.net, which is the place where I'm going to be getting all these stories from now on. I'm sorry to disappoint any of you guys that were hoping for the next chapter of the next story. It's just, there are so many MLP readers out there that are way better than me, like Obub Scribbler, Lost Narrator, Crazed Ramblings, just to name a few, and they all have much more experience doing this than me. I'm really hoping to make this a big series in a few years. After all, when Mr. Creepypasta started posting his readings, the idea of a dramatic reading was still pretty foreign to people, but now he has over 1 million subscribers, and he's even done a few audiobooks, so I think this thing could do really well. So if that sounds interesting to any of you, then just wait for the video to start at the end of this announcement. And for everyone else, thank you for listening to my readings these past 2 years. And for the last time on this channel, Immune to Gravity out. Hello everyone, this is Campfire Productions, bringing to you the first episode of Tales by the Fire. In today's episode, I will be reading to you Marked by Darkhawk14. The story of a young girl born with a horrible curse, and her journey in discovering that the world around her may be more cruel and horrifying than even the curse itself. Thank you all for listening, and I hope to bring you more stories in the future. Now, let's get started. Prologue. Queen Neriana's face was strained and shadowed in the candlelight, her jaw locked in pain. She breathed deeply as her husband pushed her dark matted hair from her forehead, his brow creased deep in concern. "Not much longer now," reassured the midwife. With well-toned arms, she dabbed sweat from Ariana's forehead. The midwife was a bit more full-bodied than most women, but she was the best midwife in all of Varaki. No one else was allowed to deliver the king and queen's first child.
Isn't there anything I can do?
Asked King Alaric, his voice sounding as if he were the one in pain. He rubbed one of the inky marks on his arm, then grabbed his wife's fragile hand and squeezed it tightly. The midwife hesitated for a moment.
I suppose a little more light would be nice, Your Majesty,
she said, more to occupy him than to bring light, although outside the castle walls, night had fallen. Alaric nodded and closed his eyes as if concentrating. At once, the room lit up, as if the walls were made of glass on a sunny day.
Push,
said the midwife, as another set of contractions rippled down Ariana's abdomen. Her face twisted in pain and effort as she clutched Alaric's hand fervently. He clasped her hand tightly between his own, saying a silent prayer to Varak. Queen Ariana cried out with one last push, and seconds later, the crying of an infant filled the room. In the hands of the midwife was a baby, its flesh wet and pink, smiling as the midwife suctioned fluid from its mouth and nose, then wrapped the squealing newborn in a soft blanket and handed the infant to its father.
It's a boy, Your Majesty,
she said, her voice filled with the wonder of seeing new life enter the world. Alaric's face broke into a rare smile, his eyes burning with love, awe, and pride. He had a son, an heir to his kingdom. He held the tiny infant in his arms, silent tears of joy trailing down his cheeks. With the tip of his finger, he traced the dark marks that spiraled across the baby son's arms and chest, so much like his own. The boy opened his eyes, and Alaric could see his own green eyes mirrored back at him, different than the blue most babies were born with.
Look, Ariana,
he whispered, briefly taking his eyes off of his son to gaze into his wife. Her eyes filled with love as she reached out to her son, taking him in her arms.
Casimir,
she crooned softly, telling the infant his name for the very first time. Suddenly, her look of wonder changed to a look of pain as contractions shuddered through her body. Concern again etched itself onto Alaric's face, and he gently took his son into his arms and looked back at the midwife in concern.
Don't worry, Your Majesty,
she assured Queen Ariana and Alaric.
It's only the afterbirth.
Queen Ariana shook her head.
No, it isn't,
she said, her body strained with effort.
Twins,
breathed the midwife in surprise as she went to deliver the second baby. In only 2 minutes, another child entered the world. The midwife smiled as she wrapped up the infant, who was only slightly smaller than the first of the twins.
It's a girl,
she smiled, handing the quiet child to her father. His face lit up as he held his daughter. Through cloudy hazel eyes, she took in the strange, cold world without crying. Alaric gently touched the dark, intricate mark on her neck and traced it down to her collarbone. Suddenly, he frowned. The mark didn't continue down to her arm or torso as it was supposed to. He noted in the back of his mind, but his spirits were only dimmed for a second, and he smiled again as he handed his beautiful daughter to his wife.
Callista,
she crooned.
Callista Renata Varaki Biramont, and Casimir Valaric Varaki Biramont. One day you two will both be great, my beautiful children. This kingdom will be yours to nurture. She beamed at her children and her husband. "Excuse me, Your Majesty, but may I see your daughter? It's unusual that she hasn't cried. I want to be sure that she's breathing well," said the midwife gently. "Huh? Yes, of course," said Ariana, looking worried again. The midwife stepped forward, taking the girl from her mother's arms. Suddenly, a strange current seemed to tear through the infant, causing her body to shudder. The midwife looked down at the infant in concern. Knowing that she had been taken from her mother, the baby began to whimper. Her whimper quickly escalated into an animalistic shriek, and her hazel eyes filled with tears. She flailed her tiny arms, and her worried parents watched. She started to change. Her tiny fingernails lengthened into needle-sharp claws. Dark fur covered her body, and her eyes gleamed green. Her face lengthened into a muzzle, and tiny yet perfectly formed incisors emerged. A snarl came from the infant, who looked more animal than human. The midwife practically threw the infant back to Ariana, her eyes wide with horror.
What is this, child?"
she gasped.
"Oh, I've delivered a monster!"
She turned and ran from the room, not glancing back even once. In shock, Ariana and Alaric stared at their daughter. Before their eyes, she was changing again, back to a human baby. She gurgled happily next to her brother and mother, unaware of the horror on their parents' faces. Alaric looked away from his daughter, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. He spoke, his voice rough with disgust.
"What have we created?"
That was Marked Prologue, written by Darkhawk14 and brought to you by Campfire Productions. If you want to keep up to date with every single reading as it comes out, then like and subscribe. And if you aren't patient enough to see what happens next, then go to Darkhawk14's Fiction Press channel in the description, where the entire story has been written and posted. Thank you all for listening, and I'll see you next week on Tales by the Fire.